Okay, so the second theme, so it's theme 2, which is creating a welfare state. So it's a bit of a funny thing the way that it's divided. So it's got, the first theme is really more generally social welfare or provision of social welfare, which basically covers any kind of welfare provision. And then oddly then it kind of then has these two other sub-themes where it's like health and education. Health in particular, you'd argue definitely comes under welfare provision. You could argue comes under welfare provision, but they oddly enough separate education and health from social welfare. So this first sub-theme, it basically deals with creating a welfare state more generally and provision of welfare more generally, but with a more specific focus often, as you'll see, the focus tends to be on, especially in the early period of unemployment. But yeah, anyway, so the theme kicks off with a general look at welfare, and the overall questions for this sub-theme, what they tend to focus on, sorry, I forgot to give you what they tend to focus on is, I would say, the following questions. In the interwar period, the heavy focus is on the question of to what extent is welfare provision in place in the interwar period, or how much welfare provision is put into place, or how much does welfare provision change in the interwar period. In the post-war period, it's a little bit more complicated. I think the most common kinds of questions, and I'll kind of deal with these as well, they can often ask you, I think, questions about what the main reason behind the creation of a comprehensive welfare state was after the Second World War. They can also potentially, though I'm not going to focus on it in detail in this lecture, so you might want to look at it yourself. They could also potentially ask you how far a comprehensive welfare state is created after the Second World War. I'm not really going to focus on that much though. What I will do at the end though focus on is, and this is another kind of common topic, they can also ask you about the challenges to the welfare state that come about in the kind of 60s onwards. So how significant the challenges are to the welfare state, or what the most significant challenge is to the welfare state, those kind of things. Okay, so what I'm going to do first of all, kicking off, I'm going to do a lot more background stuff to this topic than I would for any other topic. The reason being, this is one of those ones where I think it can be quite confusing, especially if you don't have at least a basic understanding of what is available before 1918. So, first things first, by definition, so I've already kind of mentioned this already, but when we talk about welfare, we're basically using, it's a really general term that is used to refer to aid that you would give in any form to groups in need. Okay, so when we refer to welfare, it's basically aid or support to those in need. It's usually, you usually think about providing it to the old, the young, the sick, and the poor. Okay, those are the four usual groups. Interestingly though, in terms of like the history of welfare in this country, like a really basic outline, up until the 19th century, really, you had this distinction between the undeserving poor and the deserving poor, or people who were deserving care and those who weren't deserving of care. And the idea was that you deserved care if you were old, young, or sick. Crucially, the poor were not seen to necessarily deserve care, because if you were a healthy person of working age, the idea was you basically deserve your condition. Okay? And so to receive any kind of state support, if you weren't one of those three categories, old, young, or sick, you would have to prove that you deserved that care. And that's a very humiliating process. Again, part of deserving, you have to deserve that care, you actually are in need, there are reasons why you can't be in work, that you're a morally upstanding person. So yeah, it's a very humiliating process. So state support, in the 19th century in particular, primarily comes to a place known as the workhouse, which is basically a place of accommodation and employment for the destitute. If you've read any Dickens or any 19th century literature, the workhouse is often a very common, setting for a lot of stories. Just to kind of develop the idea of it a little more, another phrase you will often, and I'm explaining these things quite a bit, because especially if you go off yourself and you read the textbooks, they will often talk about the workhouse and the poor laws. And if you don't know what the poor laws are, you're going to be like, what on earth is that? So again, the poor laws are really complex, so I'm going to try and simplify it. Essentially, the poor laws are actually a really old system of state relief and support that pretty much dates back to the Tudor times. We're talking about Elizabethan laws here being passed. And so it's it's an old system of relief that the state creates in basically around the end of the 16th century. And this is the law which actually creates the distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor. And so originally, the poor law basically is outdoor relief. So aka, you get relief in your own homes. By owning your own homes, basically you get money. You get money, financial assistance, that kind of thing. From the 19th century onwards though, and again, I'm not going to go into the details of this, but they pass a law which then shifts the focus of the poor law away from outdoor relief, aka you get assistance, because that assistance has to come from taxation, and people aren't happy about that. Instead, it goes towards what they call indoor relief, in other words, the workhouse. So increasingly, poor people are housed and put to work for several hours a day in the workhouse. The idea behind the workhouse is, originally, you get housed there, you basically put in work and labour, and in return you get clothing, food, shelter, etc. But then part of the idea behind it, the conditions are actually designed to be deliberately tough, so that it discourages people from actually wanting to use them in the first place. In other words, because it keeps up this idea of deserving and undeserving poor. If you are the undeserving poor, or rather, if you're a working age, if you're a healthy person of working age, you're obviously not going to want to go to the workhouse because it's terrible. You yourself can work, you will go and find work. So it kind of rests on this idea that there are people out there who don't deserve help, because actually they should be working. So it has there's a lot of real stigma surrounding the workhouse, where the people are treated, the discipline that's involved there. They're not very nice places at all. Again, if you've read any Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist obviously starts off in the workhouse. That's kind of the typical impression of what a workhouse might have looked like. They later on, however, begin to be transformed into infirmaries to accommodate the sick and the elderly. That's a point which I'll develop more when we look at healthcare. When we look at healthcare, I'm going to come back to the workhouse because in terms of understanding how hospitals develop and early health reform, that's an important point. So I'll come back to it, but just leave it like that for now. Last thing to explain as well, a phrase that you should be aware of, because again, if you read the book, or the textbooks, they always mention this point, are the poor law guardians. So obviously there are still decisions to be made about who should receive relief. Okay, and what the poor law creates is the poor law basically creates these local committees in every single area who are in charge of deciding who gets assistance or not. Okay. The people in charge of these committees, or these committees are basically called the poor law guardians. And the poor law guardians are the people who decide who receives relief in the first place. Again, it's just worth knowing what that is, the poor law guardians, because when you read past the textbook, when it explains later changes, it will talk about the abolition of the poor law guardians and replacement by other organisations. So, the last bit of context. Just before our time period starts, so up until the 10th and 20th century, welfare provision is really, really limited. It's not considered the duty of the state to provide any kind of welfare for people in assistance. The Liberals come into power in 1906, and if you're doing a traditional Britain course, you would have looked at a lot at liberal reforms. So we're not doing that because it doesn't really come into our course. But the Liberals introduced some limited reforms in terms of welfare. And what they do is, first of all, they remove the distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor. Okay, so things, for example, like pensions become a right for a lot of people. Having said that, it's still the extent and nature of liberal reforms like pensions. They also introduced unemployment insurance. Is they're only for the poorest people, and they're only for a really short period of time. So it eliminates the distinctions and the stigma that previously existed. But it's meant to basically be, if you think of the analogy, I think it's Churchill himself who gives this analogy. Churchill, when he's describing the laws, I think he says that the role of these of the laws is to provide a lifebelt for somebody who's basically at sea, but not actually bring them to shore. Which kind of gives an idea of the philosophy behind it. It's basically, if you fall upon hard times, it's something to keep you kind of afloat. I'll briefly mention as well what unemployment insurance is, because that also is quite an important context. The Liberals introduced a really important law, I believe it's in, I'm not sure what year it is, I think it might be in 1911 or something like that. So it's unemployment insurance, and what it does is it basically provides coverage for workers in a small number of professions. Basically, if you're one of a few select professions, you have the option to pay into an insurance pot from your own weekly earnings. You pay contributions into a pot, and then if you lose your job or you're unemployed for a while, then you can receive money from that pot, provided you contributed to it in the first place. Having said that, it's really limited. It's only available to a few professions, so actually it only covers 10% of the adult male population of the country, the working population. So as I said, the welfare provision that is available at the end of the war, 1918, it's simply, you can really see it's really a minimum level of support for the absolute neediest people. It is not a universal welfare state that looks after everybody and provides long-term support. And so just that context is very important to establish, so you kind of know when you do read about laws that are being brought in, what changes they're actually creating in the first place. So that's the basic background and context. So what I'm going to do in terms of this interwar period, here's how I basically structure it. I'm going to basically go through, I think you can divide the topics into three things. Unemployment provision, so and that's the big topic. The big topic is how you deal with unemployment. Especially for those of you, if you've listened to the economics lecture, or you've been doing the economy topic, sub-theme, you'll remember how unemployment is a really big story in the interwar period, in large parts of the 20s and for most of the 30s. So unemployment is the big thing in terms of how they provide for that. We're also going to briefly talk about pensions a little bit, and also a little bit more about housing as well. But unemployment is the main one. So I'm going to run through the changes that take place in unemployment provision and how far they're successful or not. So, the first thing you can say, what you can definitely say in this period, if we talked about how, or if I've said already how, at the turn of the century, the state does not really see it as its role to care for the poor, or rather, to provide relief or assistance to all the poor. So it's not really their duty, their responsibility. You can definitely say that in this interwar period, even if some of the provision is limited and takes a step back, the state definitely accepts its responsibility or need to provide employment, or provide relief rather for the unemployed. The first way that's demonstrated is the immediate aftermath of the First World War. Okay? A bit of context to what happens at the end of the First World War. You've got lots of soldiers who come back at the end of the First World War. There is a really short-term consumer boom that does not last very long. And within about a year or 2 years of the war ending, suddenly there's a slump, and you've got millions of men who are unemployed, and you've got lots of soldiers, over 1 million soldiers, returning soldiers who are unemployed. Many of them are basically beggars, or living as beggars in the streets, potentially facing that, and living in poverty. So the government's solution for these soldiers when they come back is to actually give out dole money. And so I'll tell you what dole money is basically. Dole money, it was an unemployment insurance. When you talk about insurance, insurance is paid for by workers' contributions. Okay? When we talk about insurance, insurance comes from workers' contributions. The state itself technically pays nothing into that. Dole money, however, the state literally pays for it out of general taxation. So the government actually pays out unemployment, essentially benefits, if you want to call it that, to returning soldiers out of general taxation. They've never done that before. And they decided that they have to provide for them. Because the reason being is, millions of these soldiers who come back from the First World War are not covered by the liberal reforms we've already talked about. The reason being, some of them did not actually work in those professions to begin with, therefore aren't eligible, or some of them, for example, who did work in those professions, did not actually contribute enough into the pot, therefore again, are not eligible. So you have lots of these soldiers, and millions of men in general, who are not eligible for any kind of unemployment insurance or assistance, and so the government decides they cannot allow these men to go on without support. One reason, of course, is because of the fear of revolution, where we can't have millions of unemployed men running around the place causing trouble. Another reason is just the principle of these men have fought for the country. It's not acceptable morally to allow them to come back and be living on the streets. So the government actually immediately after the First World War pays for these for a lot of men's unemployment benefits or assistance, relief, through general taxation. And that's straight after the First World War. And then in 1920, the government takes it a step further and actually tries to extend the coverage. They try to provide a long-term solution. Again, the government clearly sees its responsibility to provide relief for the unemployed. So, 1920, this is the first act to know, and the acts might be a little bit confusing in terms of the names, they're quite similar. The government passes in 1920 this act, the Unemployment Insurance Act. What this does is, this extends coverage of unemployment insurance for millions more workers. If we said how the original liberal reform only applied to a limited number of professions, this new law extends the provisions to cover a much wider range of professions. So it takes in millions more workers. So it's a more long-term solution. Again, the government's trying to find a solution to this issue and sees it as its role to do that. However, you could kind of argue that this act doesn't really work in the end and actually encounters some problems. What happens, unfortunately, for the state or the government is this scheme or this act is brought in just as unemployment begins to soar. Now, why is that a problem? If unemployment is soaring, what happens to those funds going into that pot, that insurance pot? That pot does not come from general taxation, it comes from people's contributions. And so the system rests upon the fact that you will always have most people in work. Therefore, the people who are in work are paying for those out of it. When you are in work, you pay into the pot, and so there's always enough to go around. When unemployment soars to quite high levels, suddenly you have fewer people paying into the pot, and you have more people claiming from the pot. The net result, not enough to go around. So actually, what happens is, the funds that are available to pay for workers' unemployment relief, it basically completely drains. There's none left in the pot, and so there's actually no money to pay these men, despite the law being brought in. And so the government, in response, again, they can't let men go without assistance, or certainly in the short term, and so they again resort to using general taxation to pay for them, which was not the original aim. And so as a result, the government tries to find ways to reduce the number of people who are receiving unemployment assistance, because it's draining their own tax money. And so the government then creates these seeking work tests. So essentially you have to prove that you're looking for work. Essentially, the detail of it isn't that significant, but the method, or the idea behind it, it's to restrict the number of people who are eligible once again. So they end up having to reduce, they widen the net, but it's kind of not really worked out because they're losing money, so they're trying to then sort of restrict the provisions once again as a result. And so you've got, by 1930, 3 million claims being rejected for unemployment assistance. So you could kind of use that as a counter-argument that due to kind of the economic situation, attempts to kind of widen welfare provision have to end up being scaled back a little bit as a result, due to what happens. Or due to the nature of those provisions in the first place. But then it gets worse. Obviously, the big story of the interwar period, if you're thinking about unemployment, is, no surprises, the Wall Street crash and depression which follows it. So, in terms of retrenchment, so the 1930s, you could say, is a period of retrenchment for welfare provision. And by retrenchment, I mean scaling back. Okay, so by retrenchment, I mean scaling back of welfare provision. Okay, so the Great Depression, or the onset of the Depression, was basically a huge setback for welfare provision. I'm not going to massively go into this detail, because if you've watched the unemployment lecture, I talked about quite a lot then. And again, if you just looked at the economy topic, you'd have looked at it quite a bit. But long story short, the Depression sets in. Ramsay MacDonald, as Labour Prime Minister, he basically gets forced into making massive cuts to the budget to balance the books in 1931, and the banks essentially force him to slash welfare spending. the Labour government, and it destroys their government basically, and that's what brings in the national government. Again, we've talked about that in the politics lecture. The Labour government is forced to slash their spending, they collapse, the national government comes in instead, and they're forced to slash welfare spending. And we literally mean forced, they have no choice. International banks place huge pressure on the government to reduce welfare spending, and they have no choice in the matter. So, the national government introduces an act in 1931 called the National Economy Act. This is where the real controversy begins. I'm going to briefly just go over what it includes and I'll go over its impact. So it basically just does the following two things. The first thing it does is it disqualifies short-time workers from receiving any kind of unemployment assistance. So in other words, if you work a job, so let's say you only work half the time during the year, or that you have a job sometimes, you don't have other times, or your hours are being reduced, etc. You're not eligible for receiving unemployment assistance. This disproportionately affects the people in the most deprived areas, aka the former heavy industrial heartlands, the shipbuilding, the parts of South Wales and the north, Tyneside, etc. Because in those areas, due to their own industries doing badly, a lot of men are now working, or sort of short-time workers. They still have jobs, but they're basically on massively reduced hours. Therefore, they've actually lost work, but they're not eligible for unemployment insurance. And so actually, for a lot of men in parts of the country, and especially these old industrial heartlands, it actually pays more to be unemployed than to be in work. Of course, it's worth saying both of those situations pay badly. So if they're in work, they're getting very, very little because they're working part-time or short-time hours, and they're not receiving any aid. And if they're not working and they receive unemployment, they get a little bit more, but it's still a small amount. So this disproportionately affects workers in the old industrial heartlands. And then the second thing it does, and this is the really, really big one, and it's the most controversial measure which the national government introduces in the entire period, and it really just creates so much resentment, I'm going to go into that. Benefits or support only lasts for 6 months. After the 6 months expire, in other words, if you are long-term unemployed, you have to reapply for support, and to be accepted, you get what they call a means test, or you are means tested. And by means test, they said, well, I'll go into what it means in a second, but they essentially look at how poor you are, whether you actually truly need it. Another thing that comes along with it, that links to the means test, the poor law guardians that I talked about at the beginning, so under the poor law you have these local committees who decided who deserved help and who didn't. The poor law guardians are abolished under the Act, and instead they're replaced by the public assistance committees. Again, they're local committees, and like the poor law guardians were, and they basically are in charge of determining who is eligible for state relief. Okay? And what that means basically is that the public assistance committees, or PACs, their job is to administer the means test. If your benefits run out, or if you've passed your 6 months and you need to reapply, the Public Assistance Committee is in charge of going to people's homes and conducting a means test to basically decide if that person is eligible for state assistance or not. Okay? So this means test is the most humiliating and controversial policy of the national government. The means test basically has to investigate your living standards, right? And what they will do is they will assess all forms of income to ensure that the system is not being abused. So every single person in a household's income will be added up, even children. So yes, every person's income gets added up. They will basically search your home. Again, if you watch the Andrew Marr, he has this comment of people in the means test actually inspecting people's pots to look at what cuts of meat they're eating, because of course if you're eating certain food, then clearly you're doing right for yourself. So it's a really comprehensive test to check, do you deserve to receive help or not? And it's a humiliating process. Additionally, so They would also check to see if you had savings or jewellery or property of any kind, like any possessions you might have. And the idea is you would have to exhaust all of those savings, all those things, before you would receive any help. They all get factored into what you've got. Everything is factored. Additionally, as I said, children. So if you have young adults living in your home but haven't left home yet, their income also gets added into it. You might not be doing well, but again, their income will be added into it. So again, so you've got situations where a lot of young adults or children, when I say children, I mean children or people living in those homes, but young adults basically, who are working, would have to leave home because their income counts towards what's being checked into the means test. In 1934, they passed the Unemployment Act. That takes measures even further. What it does is, so the rates that you receive after the 6 months, if you pass the means test, if you pass the means test and you're eligible for assistance, the amount which you received after the initial 6 months in 1934 gets cut. I think, though, don't quote me on it because I might be wrong, you might want to check it out. I think the number is 10%, but I think I might be wrong on that. But it definitely gets, the rate itself definitely gets slashed, which of course creates further problems for those living on long-term benefits because they're long-term unemployed. And so what you have in the 30s are really wide-scale protests taking place as hundreds of thousands of people's lives basically begin to crumble, and you've got lots of people basically living in poverty across the country as a result. And so the poor relief itself, so you've got people living in poverty in the first place, and those who are able to receive assistance. Poor relief, again, begins to become a humiliation despite the attempts to remove stigma that takes place in the past. And so stigma is still attached to those who are receiving poor relief due to the means test. And so this whole period of the 30s in many ways is a step backwards. In terms of why it's a step backwards, it's clear that the government has not abandoned its belief that it is their role to support people, but the economic situation and outlook of the time forced their hand, and they had no option but to make these changes. Okay, so that's the story of unemployment provision. You can say that the government accepts its role to provide assistance and does initially attempt it, but the circumstances force their hand, and in the end, the situation is one whereby the net has basically been drawn in again after being widened beforehand. So unemployment is the big one. I'm going to briefly go over pensions and housing. They're smaller points, but they're still valid for this topic. So the second change that is made is to state pensions. So the situation with state pensions in 1918 were quite a controversial one, because basically widows, orphans, and children of the deceased had no eligibility for state pensions. Additionally, state pensions were also means tested. So pensions were only actually available to people who were of a sufficiently poor background. Otherwise, there was no scheme for them. The main act or law that's passed in this period is the 1925 Pensions Act. And it basically provides pensions for people who are between the age of 65 and 70, who previously did not receive a pension. For example, groups like widows, etc. Importantly though, it's not funded by general taxation. It is funded once again, like most things in this period, via compulsory contributions. You have to contribute to a pension pot, and then that's what you receive at the end of it. It's not funded by taxation. Labour are originally quite critical of that as a policy, because it basically penalises people on poor incomes. But again, given the same points we've talked about with the issue of unemployment provision, it was really the only practical method given the quite challenging and difficult economic climate of the time. So it's somewhat limited in that sense, but there is progress made on pension provision. and it's for a much wider range of people than it previously was. So this definitely is a positive change, or an example of the welfare state being expanded, or provision being expanded. So pensions is very simple. I'll also talk about housing. Situation with housing in 1918, again, is a problematic one. You've got slums across inner cities that are very widespread. Inner cities are really cramped and very dense places. The living conditions aren't very good. Yes, they've got very poor living conditions. So the government, at the end of the First World War, had promised, and this is a phrase worth remembering because it's one that actually comes back in a couple of places, especially in the Second World War. The government had promised at the end of the First World War, during the First World War, to provide homes fit for heroes for returning soldiers. Okay? As I said, the government did see it as its duty, genuinely, to provide for these men who had fought, and their sacrifices would not kind of go in vain. But unfortunately, it didn't really work out so well. So the government tries to build quality houses to meet demand. However, the problem is, as we've already talked about, the costs start to bite in the early 1920s, and so there's actually a shortfall of 800,000 homes. So they're actually 800,000 homes short of what they needed to build to actually provide for the people who were returning from the war. The main reason for that, or one of the main reasons for that, or it's made particularly worse, by the Geddes Acts. Again, we talked about the Geddes Acts when we looked at the economy. So just a brief reminder, if you haven't watched that one yet, or if you do, go back and watch it. So 1921, the government has quite high national debt, and so they are forced to slash public spending to help pay off or balance the books and get rid of the national debt. So most of it comes from defence, but a lot of the money comes out of the essentially, as it is, the welfare budget. And that comes out of housing projects and also unemployment assistance. So, due to the Geddes Act, there's a need to cut public spending due to national debt. Again, if you go through the economy topic, you can see more about the Geddes Act itself. They don't have the funds to actually build the homes they want to in the first place. And so, although the government's intentions were in the right place, although the government's intentions were to provide housing for these men, in reality, they fell short of providing enough immediately after the First World War. So if you're talking about the immediate aftermath of the First World War, the government definitely falls short of providing enough housing for the people who need it. And so you've got a situation where, for example, married young couples, or a lot of married couples in this period would continue to live with their parents as a result, because there are not enough homes to go around, or there are enough homes being built. However, if you are going to swing it the other way, and this is the point you can make for the entire period, like the welfare, or like the unemployment point, is it's clear that the principle of the state providing housing has been established. Okay, that principle has clearly been established. So that's that point. So moving on to that period, though, construction does start to take place. So there are a few small acts that are passed. You've got housing acts passed in 1923 and 1924, and also an act in 1930 by Labour that encouraged home building or construction of more houses and slum clearance. And so the combination of these acts altogether mean that by 1940, 4 million new homes have been built. Though it's worth mentioning, because we've already talked about how there's a shortfall, a lot of that housing, or most of that house building takes place in the 1930s. The state funds, in particular the 1930 Act, the second one about state funds, the 1930 Act also uses state funds to rehouse people who are living in overcrowded inner city slums into kind of new homes that are being built in a lot of the major cities, and all the outskirts of the major cities. And so the housing situation is gradually alleviated during the period through large-scale house building. In particular, in the 1930s, there is a house construction boom, but it's not completely alleviated. Again, on the home construction boom, if you look back at the economy lecture, it talked about a boom in property construction during the 1930s. but it doesn't totally alleviate or solve the problem. Okay, so that's the interwar period. So in terms of the interwar period, if you get any of these questions about how far or how to what extent was a welfare state already in place before 1945 or 1939, or to what extent or how far does it change, etc. A really nice conclusion you can kind of draw, because it kind of ties everything in, especially kind of aiming for those top level 5 responses where you need to have this overall analytical point that brings to your argument. The really overarching pattern is one of the government clearly shifting towards wanting to provide more welfare provision and clearly accepting its role in doing that, and attempts are made to kind of move towards that in that direction, but they are, for the most part, or where they fall short, is because they are undermined by the economic climate of the day. So that's the way you can. That's a nice conclusion you can draw. I think that's quite a valid one as well. That can often bring together a lot of the different points. Okay, so the focus then in this next period is then the Second World War. This is one of the few topics, I think very often I kind of skim the Second World War because I feel like the points in it aren't all that relevant to a lot of other topics, and I feel like they often don't factor into exam questions that much. I think the one topic where you really, really want to have a deep understanding of the Second World War is this welfare provision topic. I think you can easily get a question about how far the Second World War is the main reason behind the creation of the welfare state, or something along those lines. The Second World War is really crucial in establishing it. And so I think this is probably the most likely topic to ask you about the Second World War. Every single topic mentions it, but I think it's most likely for this one because there's so much stuff you can talk about. Okay, so Second World War basically witnesses a shift in attitudes towards, or begins to shift in attitudes towards welfare provision. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to go through the different reasons as to why there is a shift in attitudes. By the end of the war, it's quite clear there is a consensus among politicians and the general public that welfare provision needed an overhaul, and that actually the government needed to develop a quite fair and consistent system that had quite long-term solutions to problems in the country, not simply responding to them in the short term. In other words, people come around to the idea of creating a comprehensive welfare state, not the safety net, which Churchill talked about, that I mentioned at the beginning, but actually a comprehensive welfare state that looks after people, as the phrase goes, from cradle to grave. So I'm going to run through the different reasons as to why you can argue this shift in attitude takes place, and I'll lastly talk about what that actual shift is in the first place, or rather what those changes are. So the first thing, it's the experience of total war. Okay, the war. The experience of total war had basically prompted, as they say, total solutions, such as rationing and the provision of bomb shelters, and the government basically provides those things for everybody. Additionally, it promotes some of these ideas of fair shares of resources. So this idea of rationing, everybody has to have their provisions rationed. Everyone basically has to get a fair share of the country's provisions, etc. It kind of promotes and helps support this idea in the country that people should make common sacrifices, or there should be common sacrifices that everybody enjoys. Additionally, it kind of helps, and so as a result, it kind of helps to bring people together in the country. In many ways, it kind of, and the same point can apply to a question about changing class structure or breakdown of class. You can argue that the war does bring the different classes together. In particular, again, experiences like, or things like the evacuation of children to the countryside during the Second World War, it really opens the eyes of a lot of people, in particular those living in the country, to the scale of poverty and what they often refer to as the black spots in parts of the inner cities. A lot of people are truly shocked by the poor diet and health of some of these kids who are coming to the countryside to be evacuated. And so, total war basically creates this sense of a common identity among people. It creates this idea of actually, or it rather helps people understand the different situations of people in the country, and creates a kind of a common sort of camaraderie among the nation that actually, yeah, we should be providing for everybody else. The second thing it does is, in terms of the Second World War, is, and this is what war always does, is it really makes people okay with the idea of state intervention, okay? If we talked about how in the turn of the 20th century, people don't really support the idea of significant state intervention in the economy, in providing welfare, etc., the war changes that. As I mentioned, again, I keep referring back to this topic, but this is why you see there are some links between them. As we talked about when we looked at the economy, the government basically takes over the economy during the Second World War almost entirely. They have to spend heavily to win the war, and they basically are in charge of employment, they're in charge of people's wages, they take charge of factories, etc. And so the people see how the government spends during the war, how they take over industries for the good of the nation, right? In wartime, the state takes over industries for the good of the nation to win the war effort, and they do a good job. So it's like, hang on a minute, the public kind of get this impression of, why is it okay to do it in times of war for the good of the nation, but actually in peacetime, why can't they do the exact same thing? What is the real difference in principle between the state intervening in wartime for the national good, so we can win a war, and in peacetime, for them to intervene so that people are doing well in peacetime? What is the actual difference in principle? If the state knows best in wartime, why doesn't the state know best in peacetime? Well, what changes? That's the first thing. Again, going back to the rationing point, again, people see the effects of rationing. People become healthy as a result of rationing. And they see that the government controlling them through rationing actually helps benefit the public's health. And so again, it kind of opens people's minds to the idea of maybe the government does know best and can actually look after us. Although rationing is partially resented, especially after the Second World War, but people do see that actually it's somewhat benefited us in terms of our health, or something might put that way. So it shifts people's perceptions on the idea of state intervention, and maybe actually the state does know best and should be trusted to run, for example, a welfare state. The next point is a political point. Okay, it's all well and good if people think it's if the public's okay with it. The next point is actually a political point, because ultimately you need politicians to pass these laws and agree to this legislation in the first place. And actually, the experience of coalition government helps to bring the Conservative and Labour parties together in many ways, and they cooperate greatly on a range of policies to develop social welfare during the war itself. And so, a lot of Labour welfare provision after the Second World War is actually based on white papers, and by white papers we mean policy proposals. The white paper is a policy proposal. Labour gets lots of credit for what they bring in after the Second World War, but actually it's based on policy proposals during the Second World War that also were created alongside Conservatives. And so what that means is, again, Conservatives themselves have a greater acceptance of those policies because it wasn't a partisan thing where it's Labour implementing their ideas and their reforms. Both Conservatives and Labour were in support of a welfare state coming out of the Second World War. So there was a genuine political consensus that actually social welfare provision was the way forward. And so again, it makes it much easier to implement the welfare state if no one really in the country opposes it. There is no one really in the country opposing it, even in the political scene. The Conservative Party, it is quite likely, had they won the election in 45, would have implemented almost all of the same things Labour would have. Maybe not quite as far as them, but there would have been a welfare state no matter who was in charge. So it's not a Labour victory that brings a welfare state, because the entire political class supports it. So that's one political point. The next point you can talk about is there is the memory of the failure, and this links to these next 2 points that are interlinked, so you can actually combine them. There is the memory of the failure following the First World War. So we talked already about the failure of the homes fit for heroes. You've got hundreds of thousands of servicemen coming back from the First World War without proper homes, and they come back to live in poverty. The government is forced to step in, we talked about, and give them money for general taxation. But actually there are still hundreds of thousands of servicemen who are in poverty. And that memory really had a lasting impact. And so there was a general consensus on the public that that cannot be allowed to happen again. You cannot have the same situation repeat itself where millions of men go off to fight for the country and make great sacrifices and return back and not have a state welfare system to look after them. Okay, so people were convinced that actually we need a welfare state to look after the needs of these men coming back from the war. And then linked to that point, similar point, because it goes back to the interwar years, there is the issue of the poverty of the interwar years. Okay, the poverty of the interwar years, in particular the 30s, really left a lasting impact on the minds of a lot of people. In parts of the north, in the old industrial heartlands, where the means test really affected a lot of people. You have hundreds of thousands of people living in poverty. People are going on hunger marches. Again, the hunger marches, we talked about them when we looked at the economy. So you've got loads of these marches, people marching from parts of the north all the way to London to demonstrate about their poverty and their hunger. And so it convinced a lot of politicians, a lot of people in the public that actually the state would be providing this provision more effectively after the Second World War. This long-term unemployment, it creates really massive resentment and protest against the government. And so the government basically abandons other attempts to do so. Additionally, I mean, even if you look at some of the politicians that are in charge after the Second World War, people like Harold Macmillan, although he doesn't actually bring in the welfare state, Harold Macmillan, Conservative Prime Minister in the 50s, who is very much in favour of really significant state assistance. So actually, even though he doesn't actually introduce the welfare state, Harold Macmillan passes acts that extend its provisions. And he's a Conservative Prime Minister. He's an MP in the 1930s of an area that has real poverty, and he witnesses this himself as an MP, and it convinces men like him that actually we cannot allow this poverty to be repeated after the Second World War. And so it helps to shift perceptions within the political class, again, about the need for comprehensive welfare provision. So, what actually gets brought about? And again, this final point can also, although I'm using it to explain the Beveridge report, it can also be used as a point about why they introduced a welfare state. You could say it's because the Beveridge report is published, but I think the Beveridge report is more of a symptom of the times. But anyway, so 1942, a liberal politician, typo there on the slide, a liberal politician called William Beveridge releases a report called the Beveridge report. After he basically goes on the country and he investigates the issue of welfare provision throughout the nation. And the report basically calls upon the following things. The report calls upon the state to slay the 5 giants. And the 5 giants that Beveridge says the state has to slay are want, aka poverty, and that would be slayed through national insurance, aka benefits for people, or unemployment assistance. That the state should slay disease, obviously through a national health service, which is of course also created, The state should slay the giant of ignorance through better education, and they should slay the giant of squalor. Squalor is basically homelessness slash poor housing situation through rehousing people and building new homes. And lastly, idleness, in other words, unemployment, through full employment. So in other words, the government should seek to create full employment. Every man and woman, every man should have a job. And this report is really popular. It sets out a really popular vision for post-war Britain, and it sells 600,000 copies. It sells 600,000 copies and provides a really clear plan for the construction of a welfare state. And it shows people how the idea of welfare state can be put into action in a really practical way. And so the report's popularity, you could argue the popularity of the Beveridge report in and of itself is a reason why the welfare state is created. That is a valid point. So this can be used as reason, and the reason can be its popularity. And its popularity basically means that every major political party goes into the 1945 election either fully endorsing or partially endorsing the Beveridge report. Labour and the Liberals totally endorsed the Beveridge report. The Conservatives mostly endorse it. So it's clearly going to happen, basically. The Beveridge report is published, and every major political party endorses it to an extent. And so those are the reasons you can give, basically, for the provision of welfare in the country. Okay, so last point about the welfare state in terms of its creation, and I'll go into the challenges to the welfare state. It's not over, sorry to say, because I've got on a different thing, not on that slide. So I would say, by the way, ideally, I hope an entire essay question would not come up on this topic. Having said that, it could possibly, if it does come up, I think it will be something along the lines of to what extent is a welfare state created after the Second World War, or how significant are provisions. It'll be something about to the extent to which they provide really comprehensive and universal provisions for the welfare state, or are they limited or not? And obviously the main argument will be, as you'll see, actually it does provide it quite well. So I'm not going to go into details myself. I'd recommend you do it on your own. I'm just going to run through what the main acts are. And if you do go into them yourself in detail, if you look through the textbook, it will go through how limited or successful they are. But I'm not going to go into it myself. But the 5 main acts they pass, aside from the National Health Service Act, which I won't go into in this lesson, it creates the Family Allowances Act of 1945. That basically leads to the creation of child benefits, which get paid to the mother for every child she has, up to a certain age. It creates the National Insurance Act in 1946. That basically makes unemployment and sick benefits available to all workers. That's a really big change, especially given how much we've talked about the failures of unemployment assistance in the interwar period. It creates benefits, unemployment benefits for all workers. Additionally, all men over the age of 65, all women over the age of 60 get pensions. So if you do look into it, this topic, the National Insurance Act is a really, really significant change. That's the most important one, I'd say. You then have the National Injuries Act, 1946. That gives workers compensation, or the right to claim compensation for any injuries or accidents that are sustained in the workplace. And then you lastly have the National Assistance Act of 1948, and that basically offers welfare benefits to those who are not covered by unemployment insurance. And so I'm not going to go into more detail than that. I would suggest you do it yourself and just look at the extent to which each of these acts actually is limited in their provision or not. Because I think that's what you would get as a question if that came up, or hopefully not. Because I think it can be a little bit tricky. Okay, so that is the provision that's created. Last thing I'm going to go over So the final thing I'm going to go over, and this is a question that came up in last year's, in the first year of the AS exam. You could possibly think, one idea is, okay, because it came up last year, it'll come up again this year. I won't be so sure, it could come up again, and I actually think it does, I think it's a really easy question. But people often don't look at it in too much detail, because one of the textbooks is quite thin on it, but it's actually a really good topic. So last year they asked the question, what was the main challenge, what was the main reason behind the challenge to the welfare state in after 1960? So after 1960, the welfare state comes under increased challenge from outside influences, basically. And so you can get a question about what the challenges are, and how significant, or it could ask you, how significant were the challenges to the welfare state after 1960? There are basically, I think, four main challenges you can basically divide this topic into. Those challenges are economic decline in the 1960s, the right-wing challenge, aka the ideological right-wing challenge, IMF cuts, and declining popular support. So I'll run through those all very, very quickly. So 1960s economic decline, again, and I've mentioned it like a dozen times already today. If you watched or lived at the economics lecture or been doing that topic, this will be very familiar. So in the 1960s, there are some economic challenges in the country. The really major one is Britain in 1964 has a really large budget deficit. By budget deficit, we mean the difference between how much the government is spending and how much they take in tax. So if your budget deficit is 800 million, it means you're borrowing 800 million every single year in your budget. So they have an £800 million budget deficit in 1964, and it's due to overspending on the military and also the welfare system. And so Harold Wilson, in 1964, is advised, this is the first time where it really becomes a main issue, and Harold Wilson, as Labour Prime Minister, gets advised to slash welfare spending to help rescue the economy. So, how significant is this challenge? The answer, not so significant. Two really easy ways to argue this. First things first, even though Harold Wilson is under pressure to slash welfare, he refuses to do so and holds firm. Okay? So there is this challenge, but actually Wilson refuses. Now you could say, well, that's because he's Labour Prime Minister. The Labour Prime Minister is not going to slash welfare spending. Okay, I've got like a handout for that, I'm just going to get it in a sec. A Labour Prime Minister is not going to slash welfare spending. Additionally, so that's what I was going to say. So welfare Prime Minister isn't, a Labour Prime Minister isn't going to slash welfare. However, Ted Heath, and this is like what really proves that this point is not really that significant, the economic point. Ted Heath comes to power in 1970. He is a Conservative Prime Minister. Ted Heath actually comes into power pledging to end the political consensus on things like welfare, on things like the economy, etc. So Ted Heath actually comes in pledging to kind of end it. Instead, Ted Heath himself actually extends some welfare provisions. So the child allowance for mothers, he actually increases it under his time. So not only is Wilson refusing to cut welfare benefits, even a quite right-wing Conservative Prime Minister comes in 1970, and even he refuses and actually increases benefits in some places. So that first challenge is quite a limited one. The second challenge is the ideological right-wing challenge. And what that basically means is this. You increasingly, from the late 50s onwards, you start to get a lot of influential figures on the right wing of politics who are arguing that actually welfare is a problem, and they're starting to challenge the idea of welfare. And there are two main criticisms or points that these people make. The first one is an economic point. They claim that they claim that benefits basically lead to economic inefficiency. In addition, they also argue is that welfare spending was creating inflation. The reason why it creates inflation is because if you're paying out benefits to lots of people, those same people suddenly have more money to spend, and if people are spending money creates inflation. So as the economic challenge, the second thing they claim, and this is one which you'll be quite familiar with if you follow politics at all, which is that excessive welfare was creating a dependency culture, aka people living on welfare, some people living on welfare, were beginning to become dependent on that welfare provision. As a result, they become less likely to work, and it takes away the aspirations of those people who instead decide they're basically going to live off welfare for the rest of their life, if they can. This is more of this point in terms of the significance is a more debatable one. You can argue that it's not significant, because in the short term, it does not lead to any immediate policy changes at government level. Labour, of course, reject it, and even the Conservative Party, for over a decade, refused to accept these ideas and continue to support welfare. However, you could argue that the right-wing challenge is a significant long-term challenge towards the welfare state. First things first, it gains traction with the Conservatives, and by 1975, it leads to the selection of Margaret Thatcher as leader of the Conservative Party. She doesn't win, she's not in charge till 79, but by 1975, the consensus has now ended. Labour are in power, and obviously are going to continue, but you now have the leader of the opposition for the first time in a long time actively hostile towards welfare. So you could argue that the long-term right-wing challenge is actually quite significant, because it leads to Thatcher being elected as Conservative Party leader. Because so many Conservatives in the party itself are like, no, we're getting benefits. That's the second one. The third major point, or the third major challenge, are cuts by the IMF. So, again, for like the 20th time today, if you have recently listened to the economics lecture or been reading that topic, you'll be aware that in the late 1970s, Britain is forced to accept a massive loan from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, due to their economic situation. They are forced to accept a loan of $4 billion. And the thing about it was, there were conditions attached to that loan. The IMF basically gave the loan to Britain on the condition that they slash welfare spending. And this was a Labour government that was in charge. This is by far the most significant challenge to date towards the welfare state. I think if you're going to argue about significant challenges, I think the IMF cuts are arguably the most significant. So it actually forces the Labour government, a Labour government in particular, which is quite surprising, to slash £2.5 billion on welfare spending. That welfare spending largely comes out of housing and education. So it is quite a significant challenge in that it forces a Labour government to actually slash welfare spending. However, the limit to it is that they decide to prioritise and keep pensions and other forms of welfare. So pensions and other welfare forms are not touched by these cuts. They decide to prioritise the cuts on housing and education. Having said that, it's clearly a very significant challenge because it forces a party committed to welfare ideologically to actually slash welfare spending for the first time. So that, I think, demonstrates how significant the point is. The final point, though, and I think this you could definitely argue is the biggest, was arguably the biggest criticism, the biggest challenge, is popular support for welfare goes down. You have a growing number of working class and rather affluent working class and middle class people who begin to also see welfare as a problem. Okay, in addition to newspapers becoming quite critical. So the reason behind that is, by the 1970s, we talked about how one of the reasons why welfare came about in the first place was the public became really in favour of it. One of the reasons behind that was the Second World War. The Second World War creates this really great collectivist spirit of, we have to look after each other, etc., we're all in it together. Consumer society, however, in the 50s and 60s, increasingly creates quite a selfish generation of people who don't really have the same collectivist thinking of their grandparents. No, it's not my responsibility to help create a welfare state, provide a welfare state, if it means I get taxed higher. And so you have increasingly large numbers of people who are more affluent, and that includes lots of working class people who don't think it's actually their responsibility to help pay for a welfare state. And so you could argue this is a highly significant challenge, because actually it helps lead to the election of Margaret Thatcher in 1979, who, of course, as I mentioned already, is staunchly opposed to a comprehensive welfare state and wants to reduce its provisions. And again, that point is, and it's clearly, again, shown to be a quite important challenge, given that when she's first elected as leader, she is seen to be a massive outsider, yet she then gets elected in 1979 with quite a big majority. And so you could suggest that actually the reason behind that and what comes with it, aka slashing welfare provisions, is due to the declining support in the country, or declining support for welfare provision in the first place. And that, I think, ends that topic.